45 years. How incredible is that? Now, this morning and for Sundays to come this month, we will take time to reflect on God's goodness, God's faithfulness to his bride here at Worthington Christian Church for the last 45 years. You know, to say that this church has had a kingdom impact would be an understatement, wouldn't it? I mean, think about the thousands, literally thousands of people that have come into an eternal relationship with God because of ministry influence that this church has had over the last 45 years. And you can see in the pictures earlier that this church didn't always exist at 8145 North High Street. That it first started in some homes, like many of you are worshiping with us right now this morning, in your home. Started in a home. Then it went to a school. And then our early church leaders took a step of faith to plant a church here. And look at the kingdom impact it has had. Look at the way that our church has impacted our community. And this morning, we want to honor those early leaders, and even in the weeks ahead, honor those early leaders that helped this bride have the impact that she has. We will do that this morning. We will also conclude a series that we've been in called Summer in the Sun. And I got to be honest with you, I'm just a little bit upset about this. For two reasons, really. One, because I love summer. And you can't have a Summer in the Sun series in the fall or the winter, right? It's my favorite season of the year. I love the summer, and I know some of y'all are thinking, okay, we got the fall, we can pumpkin spice every little thing under the earth, and I get that. I love the cool mornings like we've had today, but I love the summer. And so I'm kind of sad because there's a seasonal change ahead. But two, I've also loved the series that we have been in, looking at the life and teachings of Jesus. We've done this over the last 14 weeks, and you might be thinking this morning, how are we going to end a series, and how are we going to end a series right in the middle of a book? Well, okay, our plan is to pick this back up next summer and look at the second half of the book of Matthew, a Summer in the Sun part 2, so to speak. But we've been able to look at different things throughout the book of Matthew. We've been able to see how Jesus has called his disciples. We've been able to see some of his teachings. We've heard and talked about a guy by the name of John the Baptist, the one that prepared the way for Jesus. The one that said, he must become greater, I must become less. We've seen how Jesus has performed miracles and how people have responded to him. But this morning, I believe this. This morning, I believe that we are getting to the pinnacle of this series. I believe that this morning we will be led to a place in the text where we will be left with a decision to make. A lot of times in life, we are put in a position where we are left with a decision to make of, am I going to go forward, or am I going to step back? Am I going to sit back in fear? As a kid growing up, we went to Milligan College. It's one of our Christian colleges. We went there with our family and our extended family, my aunts, uncles, cousins, everybody on my dad's side. We went down to Milligan College to do a family camp. And throughout the day, they would have, different classes, workshops, some stuff going on for the kids. And then in the evening, they would have some recreation time, stuff where you get to enjoy the campus and enjoy Johnson City on your own. And, we even stayed in the dorms, ate out of the cafeteria for the week. It was kind of cool, especially as a kid. And I remember that they had this gymnasium. And I loved going in the afternoons and the evenings to play basketball in this gymnasium. And we'd be there with my dads and uncles and my cousins. We'd play these pickup games. And it was a huge gym to me because it was a college gym and it wasn't like anything I had experienced. But in the basement, in the bottom of this field house, they had an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And as a kid, a lot of me learning how to swim took place in this Olympic-sized swimming pool. I remember specifically that the deep end was 13 feet deep. Now, to a kid, that felt like the ocean. Like you could never go down to the bottom of this pool. So I hung out in the shallow end a lot, and as the years went by and as I began to be more confident in my swimming, I decided when we were going to go back, I was going to go into the deep end of this pool. And this pool had 2 diving boards. One was a low dive and one was a high dive. And I'd go off the low dive, and as soon as I get in the water, I'd swim over to the ladder and climb up out of the water, just do that. And then my older cousins who are in middle school and high school would go off the high dive. And of course, they gave me a hard time about just hanging out on the low dive. So by the end of the week, I got enough courage I was going to go off this high dive. And climbing the ladder of this thing as a kid, it felt like this thing never ended. And I got to the top. The scariest part was walking out the diving board. I think I was going to fall off. As a kid, I remember that. I got to the end. I remember this very vividly. I can even picture where my parents were standing. And I got to the end of the diving board, and I looked down. I was like, whoa, that is a long ways. That's some deep water. Not only was I afraid, but then I had a decision to make. Was I going to take the jump? Was I going to try to lay down and grab on this diving board, which was what I probably wanted to do? Or was I going to try to get back off this thing and go down the ladder? Sometimes in life, we are put in situations that kind of resemble that. Sometimes in life, we're put in situations where we think, okay, am I going to jump? Am I going to take this next step? Or am I going to retreat back in fear? This morning, in our text, we will see this come to life. In Matthew chapter 14, we'll begin in verse 22. It says this. It says, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. There's that word again, the crowd. Now, how many times over the last several weeks, when we've talked about Jesus, have we seen Jesus in the midst of a crowd? Well, we find him again here, in Matthew 14:22, in the midst of a crowd. So we got to ask, what's the context? How are these people following Jesus? Well, in Matthew 14, a few verses earlier, you get to verse 13, the heading in your Bible will say, Jesus feeds the 5,000. So that's a big crowd. Now, at the end of that passage, it'll say that the 5,000 was counting the men and not counting the women and children. So people have been all over trying to speculate how many people did Jesus actually feed. A very conservative number, we could say, would be at least 10 to 15,000. Think about if all the guys were married and just half of them had one kid, not even multiple kids. That puts us at 10, 15,000 people. So they've been following Jesus. They've been hearing his teachings. And anytime Jesus is around, a big crowd's starting to follow. And they get to a place where they haven't had anything to eat. Jesus looks to his disciples and he says, feed them. They're hungry. They haven't had anything to eat. And I said, we can't feed them. All we have is a few loaves and some fish. And Jesus says, give me what you have. And he multiplies it. And he feeds all of these people. So much that there's basketfuls left over. So they've been following him. They got fed. And guess what they wanted next? Verse 20 says that they asked Jesus for some pecan pie and some a la mode cherry pie. No, I was playing. Just making sure you're with me. You would ask that, I would ask that, and I would also ask maybe for a cup of coffee or something. But no, they saw what had happened. And in John 6, where it records this same event, it says that they wanted to make Jesus king. There's a little phrase in there that says, by force. See, they wanted to put Jesus in the place of King Herod, the Tetrarch. Now, Jesus has a little bit of an ironic connection to King Herod. In the exact same chapter we're in, Matthew 14, at the very beginning, King Herod has in his custody John the Baptist. Remember him? Very close friend of Jesus. As you work through that passage, at the end, John the Baptist is beheaded. Now, this crowd wants to make Jesus king in place of him. There is a rebellion starting to build. They want to make Jesus king by force. And guess where the disciples would be? They'd be with the crowd. You see, at this part in the gospel, they're starting to get the idea that Jesus is the Son of God. But they think that Jesus is coming to free them from the oppression of Rome. And that wasn't Jesus' mission. So Jesus, hearing this, that they want to make him king, want to do it by force, knowing what side the disciples would want to be on, he dismisses everybody to stop the rebellion, knowing that his mission was to get to the cross. It wasn't to free them from the oppression of Rome, but to get to the cross and to free all of humanity from the oppression of sin. So Jesus dismisses the crowd. Verse 23 goes on to say this: after he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. Now let's think about this. This is Jesus. If Jesus, the Son of God, needs time away to pray, you can believe that you and I do as well. Just within this one chapter, we see Jesus feeding thousands of people, stopping a rebellion, and hearing that his close friend was killed. So he dismisses the crowd, takes time away by himself to pray. Do you ever feel overwhelmed? Do you ever feel like you're carrying a weight? Take time to get by yourself and pray. That's what Jesus does. Next verse goes on to tell us this: and the boat was already a considerable distance from land. John 6, it tells us a little bit more detail. It tells us that the boat was 3 to 4 miles offshore. That the boat is right in the middle of Sea of Galilee, 3 to 4 miles offshore, and there's a storm happening, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So the boat's 3 to 4 miles offshore. It's in the midst of a storm. Waves are beating up against the boat. The wind's pushing the boat. The disciples are rowing, trying to just get somewhere. We're about to see what time this took place. Before dawn. See, the Romans, they divided the nighttime into watches. You had 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And it was all divided into watches, 3-hour watches. There are 4 watches total. So this took place during the 4th watch, which would be between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So they're out in the middle of the lake between 3 a.m., 6 a.m. in the middle of a storm, and it says this: shortly before dawn, again, that time period, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. They're out there 3 to 4 miles. Remember that 5K you were bragging about? Jesus just did it on water. I mean, how incredible is that? They're out there, he's walking on water, and it goes on to say this: when the disciples saw him walking, again, on the water, on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Now, there's a couple of reasons why they'd be terrified. One, you and I would be terrified if we were on a boat up at Allen Creek and we saw someone walking on water, would we not? An unidentified man is walking on water in the midst of a storm. Of course they're terrified. But two, first century belief is that the water was home to a lot of evil spirits. And so they're out there in the midst of this storm, and they don't know what they're seeing. You know, think about some of the disciples who were in this boat. They were fishermen by trade. Peter, James, and John, Andrew, they're fishermen by trade. They've been out on the Sea of Galilee multiple times. And never once have they experienced anything like this. Never once have they seen somebody walking on water. I think about the other disciples, and guys like Matthew, who we've talked about in this series, who was a tax collector. And his experience around the Sea of Galilee took place on land. Could you imagine him in the boat in the midst of the storm and seeing what he's seeing with everything they know about the first century belief of water? Hey, fellas, is this normal? Are we supposed to be experiencing this? No. That's why they say it's a ghost. And then Jesus says this to them. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. It is I. Don't be afraid. Now that's an interesting way to identify yourself, isn't it? It is I. An unidentified man walking on water shouts out, it is I. Now, the New Testament was written mostly in Greek, and the Old Testament in Hebrew. So when Jesus says, it is I, it is a Greek translation of the Old Testament text where God is speaking and he's identifying himself. We see this in the book of Exodus, where God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and to free his people from slavery. Moses, no doubt, was afraid, and so he tells God, okay, you're asking me to go to the most powerful man in the world and tell him to let his free labor go. What am I supposed to say? Who am I supposed to say sent me? And God says, tell him, I am who I am sent you. When Jesus says, it is I, it is the Greek translation of I am who I am. This isn't a ghost. This is the great I am walking on water. And it hits on the ears of Peter. Peter, next verse says this, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat. He got out of the boat, walked on the water. This is Peter now. Walked on the water and came toward Jesus. See, Peter knows this isn't a ghost. Who can walk on water but God himself? I am. And Peter knew immediately, Lord, tell me to come. Jesus simply says, come. Here's what we can see from this text. In order to follow Jesus, we have to get out of the boat. In order to follow Jesus, we have to get out of the boat. Now, what made Peter get out of the boat? I can tell you it wasn't faith in himself. He's been in a boat on the Sea of Galilee 1,000,000 times. Never once has not only he seen somebody walking on water, but has he himself ever got out of the boat and walked on water. It wasn't faith in himself. It was in faith in Jesus, saying, it is I, come. And so Peter gets down out of the boat and comes towards Jesus and begins to walk on water. There are certain times in life where we get put into a situation where we can either get out of the boat or we can sit back in fear. Those don't happen all of the time. They're not everyday moments. These are easily recognizable moments, knowing whatever decision I make here is going to mean something. There's going to be huge implications to this. And we got to decide, am I going to get out of the boat or am I going to stay back in fear? Maybe this morning you might find yourself in the midst of a storm. And maybe you're wrestling with the same question. Do I keep doing what I'm doing? Do I keep rowing in the midst of this storm and get nowhere? Or do I get out of the boat to follow Jesus? And it takes courage. It takes courage to get out of the boat. Jesus says what? Take courage. It is I. It takes courage to get out of the boat. The easiest thing to do is to do nothing. That's the easiest thing. And most people do that. Most people do that. There are 12 men in the boat. Last time I checked, one got out. Most people will sit back and do nothing. It takes courage to get out of the boat. You know, a question that we have to ask ourselves is, when was the last time in my life have I taken a step of faith where I thought, okay, if this doesn't go well, I'm toast. See, a lot of times we take steps of faith where we know, okay, if this doesn't go well, I got a plan B and a plan C. I can do something different, I can adjust, and I'm going to be okay through this. But when was the last time that I said, okay, I'm going to take this step of faith? And if this does not go well, if this does not go how I plan, only the hand of God can save me. Peter did that. And guess what? When he began to fall, Jesus reached down and grabbed him. Church, if we want to follow Jesus, we've got to get out of the boat. You know, this morning, we reflect on God's faithfulness to our church over the last 45 years. And I think about the early church leaders who took a step and got out of the boat, who took a step of faith and said, okay, if this doesn't go well, we're all toast. You all on the same page? You good? You good? And they took that step of faith. Think about the early planning meetings and the discussions they had. And the step they took to put a church in a place that was surrounded by cornfields, surrounded by all kinds of grass. Nothing was around it. There was no multiple neighborhoods. There was no multiple schools. There was no Polaris Mall or Chase Bank. There was nothing. And they said, okay, we're going to put a church there. You know what happens when you get out of the boat? You can believe that people will begin to question. You can believe that people begin to question. You're going to put a church where? There's nobody there. How are you going to pay for that? You don't have any money. Peter, what are you doing getting out of the boat? Peter, stay in the boat. We're in the middle of a storm. Peter, if you get out of the boat, you're going to drown. Stay. People will begin to question. No doubt our early church leaders were faced with that. But now look around us. So many neighborhoods, and we can't keep up with the builds for the need of neighborhoods. Schools are growing, multiple schools are being built all the time. You got malls here, you got businesses there. I mean, it's just all around us. And guess what? There's a church that wants to be planted on every corner around us. But we're here because early church leaders said, okay, we're going to take a step of faith. And if this doesn't go well, only the hand of God can save us. We look back over the last 45 years of God's faithfulness to our church so that we can look forward. We look back so we can look forward and we can ask God, God, what is it that you are asking of us next? I do know this. I know there's a jump coming. I know that our church is in a position, and our church leadership, some who are still there on the leadership 45 years ago, say, okay, how is God asking us to get out of the boat next? I don't know what that looks like. I don't know when that looks like. But I know people will begin to question. What are they doing? What's that church thinking? And when we get out of the boat, we'll all know what we are doing because we're getting out of the boat together. And guess what? When you get out of the boat, it's a lot of fun. I mean, think about Peter. Outside of Jesus himself, Peter holds the record for all humanity for walking on water. That's a lot of fun to get out of the boat. It's a blast. While he's out there walking on water, the other 11 are sitting in the boat holding on to their life preservers. They're scared to death, and they're missing out. It's fun to get out of the boat because that's where Jesus is. That's where Jesus is. And if we want to be where he's at, we've got to get out of the boat. Peter, of the 12 that were in the boat at that moment, was closest to Jesus. Was he not? In order to follow Jesus, we've got to get out of the boat. Father, we thank you this morning. Our thanks goes so deep. We thank you for the 45 years that you have blessed this church. We thank you for the early church leaders that knew that man, the step of faith they're taking, that it was only because of you. There's no way that they could have predicted what has taken place today. All because of you. Lord, we thank you for them. We thank you for our church now. We thank you for what's ahead. Lord, stir up in us ways that you would like us to get out of the boat. We ultimately thank you for Jesus, for freeing us from the oppression of sin so that we can be restored into a relationship with you. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.